I did say that we were going to jump ahead because what happens at this time of the year is you get a bottleneck. Everybody's learning so much about Rosh Hashanah and about Yom Kippur that we don't have the opportunity to learn about Sukkot, and specifically about one of the days of Sukkot that very much gets overlooked, and that is called Hoshana Rabbah. Because everybody knows Sukkot and everybody knows Simchas Torah or Shmini Atzeres to some extent. Hoshana Rabbah is very overlooked. So that's actually where we're going to focus. And as a result of that, we're going to learn something about one of the species that's included in the set of the Lulav and Esrog that also typically gets overlooked. So there's quite a lot of moving parts and interesting things for us to explore. So by way of introduction, let's start first with what are the 4 species that we use in order to fulfill the mitzvah of Lulav and Esrog. So there's obviously a Lulav, right? What's a Lulav?
The lulav is the heart of the palm.
Right, it's the heart of the palm. Okay? Right, then we have an Esrog. What's an Esrog?
It's the lemon.
Okay, so an Esrog is an unusual citrus fruit. Some people call it a citron. But the point is, it's not a lemon. And every time, that we're out in the public shaking Lulav and Esrog with people, and non-Jewish people come over and they want to know, what is this thing? They say, oh, is that a lemon? And you have to explain that it's not. Okay, then we have hadassim. What are hadassim? Right, what species? Myrtle. Hadassim are myrtle leaves. They're very fragrant leaves. They're actually very pleasant to have around. And then the bane of everybody's lulav set is the aravos, especially for us living in a warmer climate. This time of the year can get very hot, and then it's difficult to preserve the lulav set as it is, and especially the aravos, they are the most challenging of all. Why is that? Because what are aravos? Willows. And willows are very thirsty plants. So the minute you cut the willow, the branch off the willow tree, it's already very difficult to maintain. And so if you want to be pragmatic, you probably should have a spare set, because at some point during Sukkot, you're going to have to, at least once, you're going to have to exchange them. Okay, so those are the 4 species, and we know that. Now here comes the question. Hoshana Rabbah has a connection with one of those species more than the other 3. Question is, which one? So who's the hero of Hoshana Rabbah out of the 4 species? The willow. The aravos. Not for the reason you're thinking. The reason you're thinking is because what we do is, as part of the davening on Hoshana Rabbah, we take a bunch of 5 willow branches and we whack it on the floor. And that's called a minhag neviim. It's considered a custom that came from the prophets. That is not the reason that there's an association between the arava and Hoshana Rabbah. So what is the reason? You've got to go back to temple times. In the Beis HaMikdash, so we do something similar in Shul. Every day of Sukkot, you go around the bima. We call that Hoshanas. You go around the bima. On Hoshana Rabbah, you go around the bima 7 times. Now what that reminds us is that in the time of the Beis HaMikdash, they used to go not around the bima, but they used to go around the mizbeach. They used to go around the altar. And on Hoshana Rabbah, they used to go around 7 times. And then they did something which was very interesting. They used to do, it's called Zoikvin Arava. They used to take a separate willow branch, besides the one that was part of their lulav set, and they used to put these arava branches, they used to put them standing against the altar. So if you know the design of the altar, about halfway up the altar is a little area that you could walk on. So they would put them standing against the altar, and the tips of these willows would lean over the top of the altar. That's what they used to do. Now, what happens if it's Shabbos? Right? What do you do on Shabbos? So during the rest of the days of Sukkot, if it was a day of Shabbos, you didn't do the whole procession around the Mizbeach. But if it was Hoshana Rabbah, then despite the fact that it was on Shabbos, you still went around the Mizbeach and you did the whole ritual, even though it was on Shabbos. So that already tells you that this is obviously quite an important tradition. Now, it's a bit of a theory, because the way they designed the calendar, and remember that Jewish calendars operated in 2 different ways at 2 different times in history. So the original version of the Jewish calendar was not like nowadays, where you order your calendar and you stick it on your fridge, or you put it on your desk, and now you know how the whole year is going to be. Originally, you used to have to wait every single month to see if somebody identified the new moon, and then they would decide Rosh Chodesh based on whether there was testimony about the new moon or not. So you didn't know in advance exactly what date Yom Tov was going to be. You had in Gunson, you had a 2-week heads up before Sukkot. Okay, is it going to be on this day, or is it going to be the next day? So when that happened, if they saw that the Rosh Chodesh was going to land up with Hoshana Rabbah being on Shabbos, then they would ignore the witnesses and they would delay Rosh Chodesh by a day to make sure that Hoshana Rabbah was not on a Shabbos. So that way they wouldn't have this issue of whether or not it overrides Shabbos or not. And subsequently, now that we use a fixed calendar, our calendar is designed in a particular way that the first day of Rosh Hashanah can never be on a Sunday. So if the first day of Rosh Hashanah is never Sunday, Hoshana Rabbah can never be on Shabbos. That's how the calendar is designed. So in other words, they ensure that the calendar is in a specific way that you'll never have a conflict about whether or not you're supposed to do the Hoshana Rabbah rituals on Shabbos or not, because it can never fall on a Shabbos, which is great. By comparison, just for interest's sake, if the first day of Sukkot, which is the main mitzvah of shaking lulav and esrog, falls on Shabbos, what do? You don't shake your lulav and esrog. And they didn't create a system in the calendar to make sure that the first day of Sukkot will never fall on Shabbos. Likewise, if the first day of Rosh Hashanah falls on a Shabbos, what do? You don't blow the shofar. And they didn't make a system to avoid having the first day of Rosh Hashanah on a Shabbos. In fact, as we've just identified, the system makes sure that Rosh Hashanah is not on a Sunday, not on a Shabbos. So something doesn't add up over here. The Torah mandates that you have to blow the shofar. The Torah mandates that you have to shake a lulav. And yet, there are various years, it's fairly frequent that it falls on a Shabbos, and then we don't get to fulfill those mitzvahs on the key days when you're supposed to fulfill them. The first day of Sukkot, the first day of Rosh Hashanah. But the Hoshanas, which is only a custom that was passed down through the prophets, that they make sure to engineer the calendar so it can never fall on a Shabbos. Why? So the answer, Tosfos, commentary on the Gemara, makes a very interesting observation, which if you think about it, makes a lot of sense. If you know that something is mandated by the Torah, you're going to take it seriously. Whereas, if you know that something is a tradition, you might think it's not as serious. So, in other words, let's say that Rosh Hashanah falls on a Shabbos and you don't blow the shofar, the shofar on the first day of Rosh Hashanah. Next Rosh Hashanah, what are you going to do? When Rosh Hashanah, let's say, falls on a Tuesday, what are you going to do? You'll blow the shofar. Nobody's going to think that you don't blow the shofar because we didn't do it last year. Because the Torah mandates that you have to blow the shofar. So you make sure you blow the shofar. But they were afraid that if 1 year goes by that we don't do the procedure of Hoshana Rabbah, people will say, it obviously wasn't that important. So we don't have to do it this year. So therefore they engineered the calendar in such a way that it will never be on a Shabbos to ensure that nobody thinks that it's not such a big deal. Okay, so what have we learned so far? We've learned that despite the fact that the Arava, the whole ritual around the willows on Hoshana Rabbah, is only custom, I say only in inverted commas, is only a custom, clearly it's a very important custom because look how seriously we take it and look how many contingencies we put in place to make sure that it doesn't get overlooked. So now we have to ask ourselves, okay, that's beautiful. I'm sure you found this very interesting and it's information that we hadn't ever learned before, but what has it got to teach us? Because ultimately, the purpose of learning Torah is not just simply to know the rules or to know the nuances or the reasons behind the rules, but most importantly, Torah is a book of instructions. So whatever the Torah is telling us has to have an instruction for us in our lives. So the question is, what are the instructions around the Arava? And in other words, what does it teach us? Now, before we can get there, I have to ask a technical question. You ready for this? I have to ask a technical question. So you've got to really put on your Talmudic hat for a moment and have a look at it. The technical question is this. On Hoshana Rabbah, when they had to do this whole procession, and they had to take their Arava stalks and had to put them around the Mizbeach, is that part of the mitzvah of Arava like it is in the Lulav? Or is this altogether independent? In other words, the language that we'll use for this, the halachic language we'll use is is there now another pe'ula? Is there another action that you take using a willow? So the first action that you take using a willow is you shake it as part of the 4 species. And then there's another action that you take where you put a willow on the side of the Mizbeach. Okay, obviously for practical reasons, it's not going to be the same one that's in your lulav, because practically the other one's in your lulav. Although technically, it's Hoshana Rabbah, and if you've now shaken your lulav, you don't have to shake a lulav again. So technically, you could actually take it out if it's the same. If it's the same mitzvah and it's just another pull, another action, you could just take it out and put it on the side of the Mizbeach. Or is it a whole independent mitzvah? There's a mitzvah to shake 4 species, one of which is a willow, and there's an independent mitzvah. So the halachic language we call this is there's another chefza, there's another entity besides your lulav, there's another separate entity called the arava that goes around the mizbeach, and therefore it's got different rules. Now, practically, besides the fact of whether you want to pull it out of your lulav or not, practically there's a very important difference. It's actually a debate in the Gemara, debate between Abba Shaul and the Chachamim, the sages, and the debate is this: in order for all of the 4 species to be kosher, they have specific requirements. So, for example, if you want your lulav to be kosher, all the leaves have to be pressed together. If your lulav opens up like a fan, it's no longer kosher. Now, of course, a lulav will start to open slightly during the course of Sukkot, but that's not open like a regular palm branch. A regular palm branch is obviously fully open. So it's got to all the leaves have to be together. Likewise, in order for your hadassim to be kosher, the hadassim have to be where the natural growth of the hadassim is that you have 3 leaves coming out of every node. And if that's no longer the case, your hadassim may not be kosher. You have to see if it's the majority of the twig or not. Aravois, the question is, how many leaves have to remain on your stalk to still be kosher? And let me tell you, this is something everybody is very stressed about every single year, because Arava's leaves sometimes fall off even before you start. So how many leaves do you have to have? So here's where you got this debate. When it comes to the lulav, the bare minimum is still got to have 3 leaves in a specific area, whatever it is, a tefach or whatever it is. Whereas the one that they used for the Arava, for the Hoshana Rabbah ritual, that would be kosher even if it only has 1 leaf left in that space. That seems to imply that it's a different mitzvah. If it's got different rules and different qualifications, that seems to imply that it's a different mitzvah. Likewise, if you have a look at the Rambam's description of how they used to do this thing on Hoshana Rabbah, he says specifically that you had to take Arava Acheres. He's clear about it. You can't pluck the Arava out of your lulav set and now use that as part of the procession. You have to have Arava Acheres. It's got to be a completely independent willow that you find that is involved in the Hoshana Rabbah ritual. That tells you clearly it's a separate mitzvah. It's not just another activity of the same mitzvah. Okay, so that's really valuable information for us, that there's something unique, there's something special about this Arava, this willow that we're using on the day of Hoshana Rabbah, and hopefully that will help us understand a little bit better what the message is. Now, if you want a message from these 4 species, clearly the best place to start is with the very famous midrash that we all know about how the 4 species represent 4 types of Jews. You know this. I'm sure you've heard this multiple times. Because out of the 4 species, you have fragrance, taste, both, or neither. So let's go through them. An esrog. Esrog smells delicious, right? If you've ever smelt an esrog, right? And on Sukkot, you can smell your esrog. It's not even problematic. And if you take an esrog after Sukkot is over, people make various things out of it. They make jams and preserves and whatever the case is, because it has both the taste and the smell. The lulav comes from a date palm, where the dates have a sweet taste, but they don't have any smell. The hadassim have no taste, but they have a beautiful fragrance, and that's why you're not allowed to smell the hadassim on Sukkot, because they only have fragrance to offer. And it should be now dedicated to the mitzvah, not for personal use. And the aravos, the willows, are the blandest of the bland. It's got nothing to offer. There is no smell and there is no taste. Okay, so now symbolically, fragrance represents Torah study. Fragrance represents the the observance of mitzvahs, and taste represents Torah study. And you can actually understand this because the Hebrew word for taste is ta'am, and the Hebrew word for a reason, meaning the understanding of something, is ta'am. So when you understand the reason of something, it's much more enjoyable. Like when you taste food that has a good flavor, it's much more enjoyable. So that's why Torah study is associated with taste. Fragrance is associated with a mitzvah for various reasons, and the most obvious reason is that a fragrance of something is not bespoke. It's not that each person has a different experience. The fragrance is the fragrance. That's what it is. Like a mitzvah. Mitzvah is the same for every single person. Also, fragrance adds value to the person who's wearing the fragrance in the same way as the mitzvah adds value to the person who has the mitzvah. So with that little, we can make like a little metric over here where we can say, so the esrog represents the person who is excellent both in study and in observance. The lulav is the person who excels specifically in study, not so much in observance. The hadassim are the people who excel in observance, not so much in Torah study. And the person who is like the arava is the person who is lacking in both Torah study and in observance of mitzvahs. So that's how we normally explain it. The Frierdiker, first of all, before we do this, you have to realize that it is not the way that people usually understand it. Usually people use the expression, they say, the arava has nothing, not Torah and not mitzvahs. That is not the case. It's not that the person has nothing. It's just that they don't excel in either area. Likewise, you can't say that the person who is a Torah scholar does not have mitzvahs. That's impossible. You cannot have Torah study without mitzvahs, etc. Okay, we'll come back to this. We'll revisit that concept. So in that system, the arava has the least to offer in the system. Yet, and here's the great irony, the Frierdiker Rebbe, the previous Rebbe, used to say that the arava represents the simple Jew. Now there's a very big difference between talking about somebody who is lacking something and saying somebody who is a simple person. Because simplicity is not necessarily bad. In fact, to the contrary, sometimes simplicity is one of the deepest states that a person could be in. If you think about it, look at a child. Children have simplicity. Nobody's going to say that children are lacking because of their simplicity. We're going to say that we wish we had their simplicity. So the Frierdiker Rebbe comes from a completely different angle, and he says that the aravos represent the anoshim pshutim, the simple Jews. What's the secret weapon of, or the secret greatness of the simple Jew? Is that a simple Jew lives with emunah pshuta, with simple faith. Which means, if a person is sophisticated, or at least they believe that they're sophisticated, and it's important sometimes to make the distinction between whether somebody is sophisticated, or whether they believe they're sophisticated. But if a person is intellectually sophisticated, so what happens really is, as brilliant as they are, they actually land up reducing everything that they experience to the capacity of their intellect. Now, I might be somebody who's very capable, but then everything is limited to my capabilities. Whereas the person who has emunah pshuta, person who has simple faith in Hashem, simple faith is limitless. So there's an incredible twist to the tale over here, because on the face of it, the arava is the least attractive out of all of the four species. And therefore, on the face of it, the arava represents the Jew, who is the least spectacular out of all the kinds of Jews. And here we've got a whole different perspective that says, don't be fooled by simplicity. Don't undermine or undervalue somebody because they are simple, because emunah pshuta, simple faith in Hashem, is an incredibly powerful and incredibly deep state to be in. You wish that you had emunah pshuta. Now, in this particular conversation, he doesn't say it, but in a different conversation, he says that the emunah pshuta, that the simple, or he doesn't even say emunah, he says the pshitus, the simplicity of an ish pashut, of a simple person, reaches directly into the pshitus of Ein Sof, or pshitus of Atzmus, into the simplicity of Hashem's essence. Meaning, simplicity is not a lack of something, simplicity is often the core of something. So if you think about it, the smallest particle is the simplest particle. So the core of something is simple. So when the person is in a state of simplicity, they connect to the essence of Hashem, which is in a state of simplicity. So now, once we understand that, we need to start looking at this Arava in a completely different light. And now we've got to start asking ourselves, so what's the lesson of Hoshana Rabbah, where you start to celebrate the Arava? Okay? That we'll pick up Mitzvah Hashem next time.